Welcome and good morning. It was perhaps inevitable that we were not going to get through this class without playing God Bless America, but it has a particular significance both for this day and for the subject of the lecture today. It is a song written by Irving Berlin, who was one of the great composers of the middle part of the 20th century, who was a Russian Jewish immigrant to the United States, came here as a young man, had a story a lot like Mary Anton's story, served in the First World War, and actually wrote this song while he was in the service in the First World War. In 1918, he thought it was a kind of cheesy song and it was a little too sappy, and so he put it in a drawer and did not look at it for the next 20 years. But in 1938, when Kate Smith, who was one of the most famous singers in the United States, came to him and said that she wanted an anthem to sing for Armistice Day, he pulled it out of the drawer, revised it, and gave it to her as God Bless America. Some of you may know that Armistice Day in 1938 was November 11th. That was the end of the First World War, and they were marking 20 years of it. You might also know that today is Veterans Day, November 11th, and that is because the name was changed in the aftermath of the Second World War, not to focus on the First World War, but to encompass all veterans who had served in both wars and in the U.S. military more broadly. So we are here on Veterans Day today, thinking about God Bless America and its origins, looking ahead to the Second World War, which is the subject of our lecture today. And God Bless America really matters for that story too, because one of the reasons that Irving Berlin decided to, pull this out of the proverbial drawer and brush it off and change a few of the lyrics and put it out into the world in 1938 was because as a Jewish man, he was looking at what was happening around the world, particularly looking at the rise of fascism in Europe, thinking about the role that the United States might ultimately play in that conflict, giving thanks, as he described it, for what the United States had done already for his family in particular. But it is one of these songs that, like This Land Is Your Land, we take as a kind of neutral patriotic anthem, but it is born out of a very specific set of historical circumstances. It's born out of a very specific set of political concerns. It's intended to be a song that's going to not only rally, but persuade people about a certain narrative of America. And it's worth noting that Woody Guthrie, who we heard from last week, who wrote This Land Is Your Land a few years later, really hated this song and actually wrote This Land Is Your Land in part in response to this song, which he found sappy and way overly romantic about the reality of life in the United States in the 1930s, still in the throes of the Great Depression. So not only are these songs born out of similar moments, but they are in conversation with each other. And I think that's one of the themes that we've tried to draw out over the course of this semester, are the ways in which, from different historical moments, songs, themes, images, ideas are passed around and reinterpreted. So today we are going to move into, there's Irving Berlin. That was his original musical, Yip Yip Yak Hank. So it's not a great musical. I wouldn't advise it. But he goes on to do a lot of stuff in World War II. So today we are going to look at World War II primarily from the perspective of the United States and its, in many ways, quite unique experience in the Second World War. A few years ago, I had an idea for another team talk course that the history department could put on that would just be about the Second World War and would take advantage of all the expertise we have around the world, right? We could put a Russianist in, and someone could do German history, and someone could do Japan, someone could do China, et cetera, because, of course, it was truly a global war, and even more of a global war than what we refer to as the First World War. So today, we are not going to spend a lot of time talking about its global dimensions, though maybe in what would it be, 2045, 2041, for the 100th anniversary of the Second World War. Maybe we'll do another teen-taught history class about, all right, we will plan it's only 15 years, 16, 17 years away. But for today, we're really going to focus on the American experience, which was quite distinctive, if not always entirely unique, in this grand conflagration that is known as the Second World War. And it is the conflagration that makes and remakes the 20th century. There's no question about it. Every once in a while, people ask me as a historian, what's the most important thing that happened in the 20th century? And the answer, hands down, is the Second World War. It redrew the maps of the world. It redrew the power relationships of the world. And in the United States, it is the force that does more than anything else, first of all, to bring the country out of the Great Depression, where we were last week, but secondly, to give the United States the government, the global presence, the institutions, and the ideas that are really going to be the foundations of the second half of the 20th century. Today, we're going to focus on what seem to be, at least on the surface, some pretty easy questions about the Second World War, but each one of them will really tell us something different about how the war developed, what its impact was, and ultimately what some of its consequences could be. So we're going to start with the question of why. Why did the United States enter the war? We're going to move on to how, who, and where. Think of these as something more than factual questions, though they are that in part. Think of them as questions about what makes the US war experience distinctive. To start out, like Irving Berlin and Kate Smith, we cannot think about the why question without reference to the First World War. First World War ended in 1918. We talked a little bit about all the turmoil that set in 1919, 1920, 1921. Fast forward to the late 1930s, we're not very far out from that story. Most people alive in the United States, many fully fledged adults, might have been children then, might in fact even have been adults, have served in that war, but everyone had a narrative about the First World War, and most of those narratives were negative stories. We talked about the reformers who emerged from the First World War, devastated that their progressive agenda had been foreclosed by the war. We talked about the hopes for something like a League of Nations, a war that was going to make the world safe for democracy, a world that was going to end all war. Well, by the 1930s, it's pretty evident that that didn't happen. And so for many Americans, the narrative of the First World War is that it was a bad idea. The United States contributed blood and treasure to what turned out to be an imperial struggle without fundamental principles at its heart, and in particular, that required the death and sacrifice of Americans for no reason that many people could see. And so when the crises of the 1930s begin, especially in Europe, also in Asia, the dominant narrative is that the United States wants nothing to do with this. Right? People are focused on the Great Depression, they're watching what's happening, and mainly wanting to stay out of it in some formal way. That cartoon over there gives you, I think, a good sense of the conventional wisdom, which is to say that this looks like we're heading toward another global bloodbath. And if the US can stay out of it, they very much want to do that. There are other voices at the extremes. These are a couple of examples of the mobilizing that begins in the 1930s around the question of the US relationship with fascism, what it is that American citizens in particular are obligated to do as fascism is on the rise in Europe. At one extreme, you have the Communist Party. These are members of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which was a group of Communist Party members who decided in the mid-1930s that it was their obligation, if the country was not going to act, to in fact act themselves, went over and fought in the Spanish Civil War, fought fascism not very successfully and at some great sacrifice. But that was one alternative narrative that was present in the United States, a narrative that was built around the left, the Popular Front, anti-fascism as an ideology and a set of commitments that was beginning to emerge in that moment. We're going to talk a little bit more about that on Thursday. At the other extreme, you had fascist pro-German and pro-Nazi movements within the United States. They weren't very widespread, but they were quite prominent. And one of the great concerns of the 1930s is not just about fascism in Germany, but is about growing fascist movements within the United States as well. So that is a photo down there from a rally at Madison Square Garden of the German-American Bund, which was one of the largest pro-Nazi organizations in the United States. You can see, first of all, that it's a pretty big rally. So these were not insignificant institutions, although certainly did not represent majority views. And I think what's interesting about both of these initiatives, both of these photographs, both of these efforts, is that they are each trying to tell a story through American history, through American images, that is making a claim about how the United States is supposed to act in this moment. We have the American flag here, and down there, I don't know how well you can see it, but a giant image of George Washington. In the 1930s, that immigration politics that we had talked about, the closing of the gates in the 1920s, is also playing a big part in this debate. One of the concerns as war is building up, especially in Europe, is that the United States is going to see a flood of war refugees coming in, and in particular, refugees from Hitler's Germany, Jewish refugees. And there's a widespread debate in the 1930s, before the war has even formally begun, about whether the United States is going to take in those Jewish refugees, whether immigration policy ought to be reconsidered. And the answer, for the most part, is no. This is a photograph of a group of German Jewish refugees who made their way across the Atlantic in 1939 on a ship called the St. Louis, got to Cuba, were waiting entry into somewhere in the Western Hemisphere. They were rejected, they were sent back, and many of them ended up dying in concentration camps. That is the state of the debate in the United States. When war breaks out in a formal sense in 1939, although there have been lots of hints of what's to come, the Second World War is said to formally begin in September of 1939 when Germany invades Poland. That is also the moment that Hitler and Stalin sign what comes to be known as the Nazi-Soviet Pact. We're going to talk a little bit more about that and its implications on Thursday. But once the war begins, the debate gets even more ramped up. I said in World War I, it took a very long time for the United States to get involved in that war. And what that meant that there was a concerted debate from many, many different dimensions about what the war's meaning would be, how it ought to be fought, what its cause and its implications would be. Well, the same thing in the Second World War. As we tend to tell this story in popular culture, you know, the United States kind of goes rushing in, saves the world from tyranny and fascism. It took the United States a very, very long time to become formally involved in the war, 2.5 years before a declaration of war was made. And during that time, new movements emerged that were deliberately aimed at stopping that. The most famous of them was the America First Committee. The America First Committee was an anti-war organization that was sort of a big tent organization. It included people on the left and the center and the right, some of whom were pacifists, some of whom were deploying a narrative of World War I as having been a disaster, some of whom were overt anti-Semites, others of whom had other agendas. Yale actually played a pretty important role in getting the America First Committee off the ground. Kingman Brewster, who later went on, I think there's a window dedicated to him here in Battelle Chapel somewhere. As a student, he was anti-war. He did not think that this generation of American men ought to be sacrificed on the battlefields of Europe like his parents' generation had. And he helps here at Yale to organize the America First Committee as a student. One of the most famous spokespeople in that moment is Charles Lindbergh, the aviator who emerges in the late 1930s as not only an opponent of U.S. entry into the war, but also as one of the country's most prominent anti-Semites. He has very complimentary things to say about Hitler's Air Force and about its industrial capacity. And Charles Lindbergh emerges as this key figure in the America First Committee. And as you can see, he came and gave a big speech in Wolsey Hall that was quite famous, but I think also hints at some of the broad tent as well as narrower sentiments that were behind the America First Committee. Coming out of this, there is then a challenge for Franklin Roosevelt in particular, who believes from the very beginning that it is not only inevitable but desirable that the U.S. is going to enter the European war in particular, that it is the obligation of the U.S. To quote unquote save the Anglo-American world. By 1940 into 1941, Nazi forces have overrun most of continental Europe. Britain is still a holdout, and Franklin Roosevelt comes up with a plan to begin to use the industrial capacity of the United States to push ahead and play a more significant role in the conflict as it's developing. But he has a challenge of explaining that, and in particular explaining why, if the US begins to make these commitments, it's not going to end up with the same situation as World War I. And in January 1941, he gives one of his most famous iterations of that set of explanations. Why is the United States going to do this, and what's going to come out on the other side? And I think what is really interesting about his declaration that the United States is fighting for 4 freedoms, you can see them here in a famous Norman Rockwell poster: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear, is how deeply rooted the war aims and war strategies are in the politics of the New Deal. That one of the things that he is saying to his allies, to his supporters, to the Democratic Party, he's just barely, not barely, but won the 1940 election, but in a much closer manner than in earlier years. And he's saying this war is going to be a vehicle for your hopes and aspirations. That if we're going to go and fight this war, we're going to fight it for equality of opportunity for youth, jobs for those who can work, security for those who need it, the ending of special privilege for the few, right? That this is what war can do. It can make the New Deal real in some way. There are other people who are advocating for U.S. entry into the war. One of the most famous is Henry Luce, a Yale man who went on in the 20s and 30s as a young figure to found Time and Life magazine, not a Roosevelt supporter, but a stalwart of the Republican Party, who nonetheless is looking ahead and trying to make his own case for war and why it is that the United States should be involved. He does not want it to be a war for the New Deal, but he does make the case not only that there's a moral obligation, not only that the United States is in some sense already in the war, that it's going to be inevitable, but that this is going to be the key to securing American power, prosperity, and influence in the 20th century, and that Americans had a choice to make in 1941, whether they were going to embrace that, grab hold of that power, in fact, make their influence felt in the world, or whether they were going to back away from it, dilly-dally, not accept what he's framing as their historical destiny. He starts his essay with a really interesting snapshot of the United States in 1941. He says, "We Americans are unhappy. We are not happy about America. We are not happy about ourselves in relation to America. We are nervous or gloomy or apathetic. As we look out at the rest of the world, we are confused. We don't know what to do." And he goes on to say, "Fortunately, I, Henry Luce, know what to do. And what we need to do is enter this war, seize hold of it, use our industrial capacity, in fact, to make the United States a great power in the world." This essay called The American Century comes to represent not only that idea, but in fact becomes shorthand for the 20th century as a whole, which is why my part of this course is called The American Century. The final important attempt to define what's going on here that I want to mention is a meeting between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt in the late summer of 1941. So again, the US is not formally in the war yet, but what they decide to do is sit down and say, okay, if and when this war is over, and if and when we've won, here's what we were fighting for, and here is what we promise. And again, you can see the ways in which these narratives of World War I, its failures, its mistakes, are being reflected here. You probably can't read all of that, but point one of the Atlantic Charter, which is signed in August of 1941, is that they are promising that these countries will seek no territorial aggrandizement, right? A promise that this is not going to end up being a war for empire, one of the central narratives of World War I. Equally interesting, point six, a promise that in fact a lot of those reforms that move for economic security, the global concerns about the Great Depression, those are also going to be solved through this war. So point six says that they desire to bring about the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field with the object of securing for all improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. In the context of the Great Depression in the United States and the context of the New Deal, in some ways, those are the paramount concerns, right? Is the war going to help with the economic malaise of the Depression, and is it going to move this vision of social security forward? Of course, what happens is that Pearl Harbor comes along in December of 1941, and ultimately that becomes the cause and the reason that the United States enters the war. It's worth noting that in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the United States declares war on Japan. It does not declare war on Germany until after Germany declares war on the United States. And it's interesting to think about sometimes counterfactuals about could that all have gone another way? But even once Pearl Harbor has happened, even once the war is formally underway, this debate about quote unquote, why we fight continues. So the film for this week is one of 7 training films that were made for young men being inducted into the US military in the 1942, 43, 44. You're watching the first one, which is an attempt to explain to men 18 to 30, newly entered into the military, why the United States is fighting. And there are a couple of interesting themes. So one is this set of themes about quality of life, economic security. Another is that it's trying to tell its story of World War I and why this time is different. Another is its vision of unity and an attempt to take all of these different groups in the United States, We've had very fractious racial and ethnic politics in the 20s and 30s, and convince everyone that they're all on the same team, they're all going to be fighting for the same things. So as you watch it, it's a pretty fun and interesting film. Think about what it's saying about the United States, its values, its vision for itself in that moment, but also remember that the fact that they felt they had to be making a training film called Why We Fight suggests that that was, even in that moment, not at all a settled question. Once the US is formally in the war in December of 1941, a new question arises. How is this war going to be fought? We just talked about why. We're going to turn to how. And that was not at all self-evident. The United States was in a very particular position vis-a-vis the conflicts overseas, which is to say that it was very, very far away. And that was both a strategic advantage and, of course, posed lots of challenges. The answer of how that is presented immediately is that the United States is going to fight this war through its industrial and technological capacity. That is the strategic advantage of this country. The 1920s had produced all of this industrial capacity. It had been lying fallow in the 1930s, but here is a moment in which tanks and guns and war material and uniforms and all of the other things that are needed to fight a war, the United States is going to be the supplier not only for its own military, but for the allies that it's fighting alongside around the world. Now, most of the fighting is taking place elsewhere in the world, Europe, Asia. And so this is the unique advantage. And this is what the United States seeks to press ahead with in a very concerted way. So industrial mobilization is the theme of the wartime home front. This is a poster that suggests the pride, the emphasis on the very stuff of war, industrial production, factory work. Last time we were talking about this on Thursday, we were saying there were some problems over there in the world of industry, lots of labor conflict, lots of organizing happening from below, and all of that gets channeled into this set of wartime strategies. Second World War turns out to be a very successful period for American labor. And the way that the war is mobilized is through a set of cooperative and public-private agreements that look quite a lot like some of those agreements and politics that have been tested out during the New Deal. This is, of course, the sit-down strike of 1937 that we saw last week. And now I want to take a minute and return to General Motors. So that was a strike at General Motors, Flint, Michigan, 1937. And this is 5 years later, and we're going to take a quick look at what General Motors is up to.
Behind locked doors and almost 100 General Motors plants throughout the country lie thousands of secrets, military secrets that Hitler would give his best panzer divisions to know. For in these plants is being designed and built a large part of the avalanche of weapons that will break the back of the Axis. Training men for the tremendous job of making, using, and maintaining the tools of war is of primary importance as General Motors makes victory its business. Production mounts and new blood is added. Girls and women take their place in the line along with the men of industry. New hands, new tools, new plants, working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. For General Motors has undertaken to produce more than 10% of all war material fabricated from metal. Thousands of workmen in 4 GM divisions turn out machine guns on a mass production basis. Output is months ahead of schedule.
All right. So you can see the themes that become absolutely central to this form of war mobilization, that it's going to be industrial production, it's going to be mass mobilization, and that the world of consumer items, cars, refrigerators, etc., that's all being converted into war production. So if you're going to do all of that, you've got to pay for it somehow. And this is a really important piece of the story of World War II on the home front, one that we all may regret in certain ways every time we get to April 15th, which is to say that like World War I, the Second World War is funded through various debt measures, some of them popular debt measures. War bonds are a key feature, but far more than any previous war, it is also funded through this new thing that has become really important over the last 20 years, which is the federal income tax. In 1939, only about 4 million people in the United States are paying income taxes. It's a very small and mostly wealthy proportion of the population. By 1944, 43 million people are paying some form of income tax. So the income tax as a mass experience is also a result of the war. And at its highest bracket, this is sort of a legendary moment in American tax policy history. In 1944, at the peak of the war, the highest tax bracket in the United States was 94%. That number, 94%, is going to be incredibly important to post-war politics, both in the ways that it helps to reduce inequality and also in the level of resistance and vicious criticism that it produces. But the income tax becomes incredibly important to this war engine as well. And you can see that there is no comparison to anything else that has happened over the course of the 20th century. This chart starts in 1929, goes up into the 21st century in terms of government spending. The modern state is born in World War II. And I mean that in a couple of ways. First of all, as you can see, government spending is incomparable in this moment. And even compared to the New Deal, we tend to talk about the New Deal as this time of innovation and buildup at the federal level. That is absolutely true, but it looks like nothing compared to what happens in World War II. And as we're going to talk about more on Thursday, it is also World War II that really gives birth to a permanent U.S. security state, a permanent U.S. military, not at the levels that we're seeing here in the Second World War, but at levels that are much more sustained and much larger than anything that had been seen before in U.S. history. That includes investment in technical facilities like Los Alamos and the development of new forms of technology and weaponry. It also means investment ultimately in a standing army and a security establishment that becomes key to fighting the Second World War, as well as the Cold War that follows. All right, so we've talked a little bit about why, we've talked a little bit about how, and now let's talk about who, because this is a war that's going to have to be fought by people and by human beings, boots on the ground. It is worth noting that part of the U.S. strategy to emphasize its industrial production, to emphasize its technological capacities, is a gamble that perhaps the United States can therefore protect its own people, not only the boundaries of the continental United States, but the people that it is sending out to fight on its behalf. Like World War I, World War II is mobilized through a draft. About 50 million men in the United States register for the draft in World War II. About 10 million end up inducted into the Army through the draft, and about 16 million people overall serve in the armed forces. This is a mass experience unlike anything that the United States had seen before or since. Just to give you a sense of how dramatic that difference is, in 1940, even at a moment when preparedness is underway, the U.S. Army has about 200,000 people in it, men. By 1944, The Army alone has 7 million people in it. And as I said, over the course of the war, about 16 million people ended up serving. So most of these people are relatively young men who come into the Army through the draft. Their average age is 26. When you watch Why We Fight, you can see that this message is going out to them, going out to people that for the undergrads in the room, right, they're mostly people about your age, thinking about what is ahead. About 40% of them are high school graduates. The other 60% have not graduated from high school. And one of the consequences of the war itself, particularly for people who serve in the military, is going to be the buildup of U.S. higher education that's going to come through the GI Bill, which we'll talk a little bit about in weeks to come. But one thing to note about all those draftees, enlisted people, officers, is that when we think about the war, we tend to think about the battlefield. And we will get to the battlefields in a minute. But most of the people who are serving in the war are serving in some sort of support capacity. Only about 10% at most of those who are being brought into the military end up serving on the battlefield. My own father, who served, who was drafted into World War II, tells the story of, he was an accountant, and tells the story of walking around. He's been made a basic training instructor, but he figures, hey, I'm an accountant. And you know what's more useful in a really big war like this? The accountant is more useful than the soldier. And so if I go around and say, does anyone need an accountant? He was going to get the answer, yes. And he spent the war in LA doing paperwork for the US government. So that is as much a part of the war experience as the more storied parts that we all know and think about. Women play a pretty important role, both in the defense industry, but also in military mobilization in a variety of capacities in both the Army and the Navy. They are, of course, not in combat. And there are other ways in which the military reflects the basic structures of American society, not only when it comes to class and who's being drafted, but when it comes to questions of gender and race. The United States in World War II, as in World War I, as in the Civil War, fights with a segregated military. When you watch World War II movies, often Hollywood has this, beautiful multiracial picture of cooperation. The US fought this war with a segregated military. And one of the things that comes out of the war is a set of claims, not only by Black veterans, but by African Americans more broadly, that you say you're fighting a war for democracy. Where is democracy here at home? It's called the Double V campaign in its most formal sense, and we're going to talk about that more as time goes along. U.S. war mobilization at home reflects much of both the hostility toward Japan in a formal sense and also some of the anti-Asian bias that has already structured what it's like to try to immigrate to the United States and the exclusion of Asians from citizenship in many capacities in the United States. Beginning in early 1942, the federal government issues an executive order saying that the West Coast of the United States is now a military zone from which the military can exclude certain categories of people. One of those categories of people are people of Japanese ancestry. The idea is to move them off of the West Coast. In theory, in its original conception, they could go anywhere else they wanted. But in reality, most people had nowhere to go and were sent to places of incarceration called relocation camps or internment camps at the time. And it's worth noting, 2/3 of the people who were subject to that treatment were U.S. citizens, people who had actually been born in the United States. And when it came to war production, of course, War production as well reflected some of these exclusions and hierarchies that operated in the rest of US society. In order in particular to do agricultural work on the West Coast, the United States initiates the Bracero program, which is bringing in Mexican workers to do this work, but without allowing them to be immigrants, without allowing them to seek any sort of permanent residency or citizenship in the United States, a temporary guest worker program. And the mobilization around the Double V campaign also has the defense industries at its heart. Black workers wanting access to the same quality of jobs as white workers. All right, so that is a little bit about why, how, who, and now I want to get to where, our final question, which will take us out of the continental United States and into the places where the war is really happening. That is in some ways the most significant fact about the war for the history of the United States, the fact that it did not happen, for the most part, on US soil. That's going to have dramatic consequences for what happens coming out of the war. The exceptions to that, and there are a few of them, are first of all the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii at that point not a US state, but part of US territory. And the other that often gets forgotten or left out of the story is the US presence in the Pacific that had come about as a result of the Spanish-American War, and in particular, the Philippines. When Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, it also takes aim at US territories throughout the Pacific, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island. And so that gives the Pacific War a slightly different character. Many Americans who are fighting in that understand that they are fighting for, in fact, US territory in a way that's a little bit different from Europe. But for the most part, the big fact of the war is that it's going on elsewhere. It is devastating the populations, the industrial capacity, the culture, the cities of vast nations around the world, but not in the United States, right? In the United States, the war is boom times. In thinking about this where question, it's also important to note that the US is in some sense fighting two different wars at once, and that makes it a little distinctive among the major belligerents, right? Its allies, Britain, Russia, China, to some degree, France, although France is occupied during this period. They are fighting local wars. They are fighting wars of defense. The US is fighting on both fronts or in both wars at once, and even within particular wars, the United States is fighting many, many different wars. So when we think about the war in Europe, I think the most famous image that comes to mind is D-Day, the landings at Normandy, which happened in June of 1944. But there are a couple of important things to note about that experience. One, that's pretty late in the war, and so a lot of the early years of US engagement with the European war is happening in other theaters, in North Africa, in Italy, and all with the goal of finally getting troops on the ground in Western Europe, but that happens very late in the war. And that Western European front is only one of the fronts in what we very broadly call the European War. The Soviet Union, an ally of the United States, an uneasy ally, we'll talk more about that, is fighting on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union has unimaginable casualties in its war with Germany. But that war is going on simultaneously, and one of the big questions, one of the things that Stalin cares most about, is whether the United States is going to intervene on the Eastern Front, and for the most part, the answer is no. And then, of course, there is a war going on within Europe itself. That is a war of extermination. It is a war of genocide, particularly against Jewish populations, against others as well, against the disabled, against homosexuals, against other groups that are deemed to be unworthy of life and citizenship. That's happening not only, and even in some sense, not primarily in Germany itself, but in this region of Eastern Europe around Poland and over into Russia around the Eastern Front. So there's another big question there that often comes up, which is why did the United States not do more to intervene in the Holocaust, to bomb the rail lines, to stop what was going on? It was a question that came up at the time, and it was deemed a secondary war measure of secondary importance to the task of D-Day, getting boots on the ground, and moving on. But it remains a source of great controversy. So there are many wars going on at once in Europe, and there are many wars going on in the Pacific as well. I think it's worth noting these are actually very different kinds of war as well. The European war is, in the end, largely a land war, though, of course, there are strategic bombing campaigns and lots of conflict in the air. The Pacific War is really a naval war. That's where the energies are focused. A lot of it is happening in these small islands in the Pacific, both former U.S. territory that ends up being reclaimed, and lots of other places as well. In many ways, the Pacific War is much more of a racial war and is described in that way, a war of vengeance against those who had carried out Pearl Harbor, but also a war that is racialized and some would argue much more brutal as a result in comparison to what goes on in Europe. I think one of the most interesting examples of that is that cartoon over there on the right, where you have your two adversaries, and Adolf Hitler is being portrayed as a human being, right? Someone to be thought of in that way, whereas the much more nameless Japs are being portrayed as beasts and monkeys, something subhuman. So these wars are fought differently. They have different purposes. In many ways, a lot of Americans feel much more committed to the Pacific War. It is a war of vengeance, and as I said, in some ways, a war for U.S. territory. And of course, it is in the Pacific that the greatest and most fearsome technological innovation of that war production machine ends up being used. And that is the bombs that are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. Again, like with the question, should the United States have done more to prevent the Holocaust? The question of whether the United States should have dropped these bombs, in particular, the second of them, has been a source of great debate ever since. It is worth noting that it was not a source of great debate in its moment. Harry Truman, in explaining why he had done that, Franklin Roosevelt has died at this point. We'll talk a little bit more about the consequences of that on Thursday. Harry Truman is in the White House and he says, look, this was a war measure. There was never really any question of what we were going to do. It ends up being up to Truman and not Roosevelt to give some meaning to the war. And as you can see from this quote, this is a photo of VJ Day, right, Victory over Japan Day, in Times Square in New York. It's important to note, right, that's an intact city. Elsewhere in the world, cities have been devastated, civilizations have been devastated, but here the United States had a pretty good time. Boom times, intact cities, a booming federal government. And that's really a lot of the emphasis as Truman delivers this message, that in fact, it was U.S. industry, it was U.S. workers, it was the U.S. economy that rolled the tanks and planes which blasted their way to the heart of our enemies. And he's really committed to carrying on that story into the post-war years. As we finish up, I just want to say a few things about how we want to make sense of the Second World War in relation to a few earlier moments that we visited. So Joanne talked about the American Revolution. David talked about the Civil War as these moments of fracture, of mass death, of recovery, of experimentation, of uncertainty, of needing to rebuild and rethink the fundamental institutions of American society. Well, the Second World War is not like that at all. The United States suffers deaths, and they are serious, and there is a set of rituals of mourning that emerge. 420,000 men die in the Second World War. But compared to any place else in the world, any other major belligerent, that's a drop in the bucket. The USSR is estimated to have lost 26 million people, 10 to 20 million people in China, Germany, 7 million. Of course, the European Jewish population, 6 to 7 million, almost the entire population of European Jews. Japan, 3 million, and the US has a few 100,000. So the United States has this very distinctive experience of not only losing many, many fewer people, but also of actually emerging from the war, not only in decent shape, not having been destroyed, but with more power and influence and money, a vibrant economy than has ever been seen before in American history. At the moment that World War II ended, the United States had something like 60% of the world's industrial capacity. Everything else had been blown up. So an incredible amount of economic energy, capacity, and wealth. The United States has an intact infrastructure that is going to allow it to move forward into the post-war world as an age of abundance. It is the thing that solves the Great Depression. It's the thing that makes this world of mid-century abundance possible. And finally, it is the thing that transforms the federal government. It transforms citizens' relationship to the federal government. It transforms the size of the federal government. It transforms its purpose, and it transforms where it goes. Right? From this moment onward, the United States is going to be engaged with and a recipient of global power in a way that is unlike anything the country has ever seen. Some of that power, some of those promises of post-war abundance, the war for democracy, also become tools that other groups who have not yet entered into that story seize, take hold of, to make a set of claims of their own about how the struggle ought to continue from that moment onward. I'm going to leave that there. Happy Veterans Day. We're going to finish out with a different version of God Bless America, which is called God Bless America Again. This one comes from the bicentennial in 1976 and attempts to carry on that historical conversation.